Defending North America from air attack is an awe-inspiringly difficult task even today. 25 million square kilometers of land area equates to an airspace of about 600 million cubic kilometers, much of it above inhospitable terrain in the continent's north. The sudden realization that Chinese balloons were regularly traversing that airspace is a reminder that even with today's technology, air defense is still nothing like a perfect science. Now step back to 1948. The jet engine is in its infancy. Supersonic fighters are at least 5 years away. There are no air-to-air missiles, so interceptors are armed either with automatic cannons or machine guns. The first National Air Defense Radar Network, Britain's chain home, was installed in the late 1930s. Although it has evolved significantly, the technology remains basic. The best available aircraft radar has a range of 5 to 10 miles. Although computers do exist, they are rudimentary and inflexible. Identification and direction is a manual task. People literally push wooden blocks on a map board and communicate between radar stations on analog telephones using the Dowding system. There is one interceptor control center in North America. It's in Alaska. US air defense is provided by a few hundred P-61 Black Widows and P-82 twin Mustangs. Both types have piston engines and are in their dotage. Neither could realistically catch and kill the Soviet Union's new Tu-4 Bull, a copy of the B-29 Superfortress. Yet this is the environment in which the USAF devised the initial requirement for their 1954 interceptor, an advanced long-range supersonic high-altitude interceptor armed with guided missiles and built around one of the most advanced computer systems in existence, aloft or on the ground. And despite the wildly ambitious performance specifications, this aircraft would not be built around its aerodynamics or engines, but its fire control system, which would be designed and procured before work began on the aircraft itself. I imagine this approach might seem a bit odd. It did, however, come from a very rational place. Air Defense Command's doctrine was ground-controlled intercept. Controllers needed to place weapons in the right place to disrupt and destroy a continent-wide attack by Soviet bombers. The further away they could do that from major cities and infrastructure, the better. The more statistically predictable the effectiveness of weapons was, the better the ADC would be at allocating resources in the event of a massive Soviet attack. To this end, in the late 1940s, the ADC had begun to experiment with the idea of a fully computerized defense coordination system. The Dowding system was revolutionary because it took radar tracks representing both fighters and bombers, often captured from different radar stations, and put them together into single tracks. The challenge with the system was that human communication and processing of the information introduced at least a 5-minute delay between a signal being recorded and instructions being relayed to an interceptor. This was acceptable when intercepting piston-engined bombers traveling at 300 miles an hour. It began to fray when dealing with high-altitude B-29s at 350 miles an hour, and was clearly impractical when planned jet bombers were taken into account. There was a high chance that the interceptor would end up in the wrong place and be unable to find its target. The ADC would ultimately deal with this problem by commissioning SAGE, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, a riotously ambitious computing project that went live in the late 1950s. But at the time the 1954 interceptor requirement was published, all the ADC knew was that the aircraft should be based on a digital fire control system and autopilot that would allow the interceptor to be controlled to the point of attack from the ground. The exact nature of that control was undefined at that point. As you can already predict, this caused a few problems. Those are to come. Hughes won the contract for the fire control system in October 1950. This wasn't any surprise, as they had won every competition for interceptor fire control systems since 1947. Many years later, this fire control system would become the MA-1 and be successfully installed in the F-106 Delta Dart. As with every single other detail of the 1954 interceptor, there would be disappointments and delays along the way. The next contract to be issued would be for the airframe. ADC wanted a long-range, supersonic platform that could operate at altitudes up to 60,000 feet. Their initial ask was for speed in excess of Mach 1 and a ceiling above 50,000 feet, but this soon grew to speed in excess of Mach 1.88 and ceiling in excess of 56,000 feet. In essence, they were looking for an aircraft with a significant performance margin over the then proposed B-47 and B-52. This was despite the Soviet Union only just having demonstrated an intercontinental bomber, and that aircraft, the Tu-4, had only been possible because they'd copied a US design. Sensibly, the ADC planners assumed that at some stage the Soviets would catch up. Convair won the contract. Their silvery delta-winged YF-102 flew on 23rd of October 1953. It was, without hyperbole, a complete disaster. Its aerodynamics looked lovely but led to terrific transonic drag that limited it to subsonic speeds and a ceiling of only 48,000 feet. It was then lost in an accident 9 days later, in which the engine failed on takeoff and the plane smacked down on the runway, badly injuring its pilot. The second prototype confirmed how bad the YF-102 was. A massive redesign based on the newly discovered area rule saved the project. Now, I find the area rule a bit hard to get my head around, to be honest, but I'll give it a go. As I understand it, the area rule is based on observations of the way that air flows around an aircraft as it approaches supersonic speeds. German engineers observed it during the war, and their work was carried on somewhat indirectly by Americans after it. What happens is that near the sound barrier, air stops behaving like a compressible fluid. Because the air is travelling so fast at those speeds, as it slows to pass around the aircraft, it jams up the air immediately behind it. The air starts behaving like it's in a rigid pipe, and those pipes start to interfere with each other as the aircraft tries to accelerate through the sound barrier. That in turn leads to a sudden increase in drag. Anyway, the upshot of this is that the whole longitudinal cross-section of the aircraft has to be taken into account at transonic speeds, not just the fuselage. That results in a tapering of the fuselage where the wings meet it to keep the airflow smooth. A Coke bottle shape, if you like. You can see the difference in this side-by-side comparison of the two prototypes. The one on the right has the aerodynamic modifications suggested by the area rule. Based on this new insight, the fuselage was stretched by 7 feet and pinched in. The third F-102 prototype flew in late 1954 and quickly demonstrated an ability to get supersonic to Mach 1.2 and to climb to 53,000 feet. Although very much not what they'd ordered, the ADC had little choice. The M4 Bison had been revealed, and its speed and high-altitude capability made the ADC's heavily armed but relatively slow F-89 Scorpion of questionable value. This was because without a performance fraction to exploit, subsonic interceptors required precise positioning to intercept. And that's fine when there's just one bomber, but it's essentially impossible to achieve with manual control in a multi-hundred bomber raid, which was what the CIA believed the Soviets would be able to muster by 1960. A greater performance fraction offered greater flexibility. Some performance fraction was a good start. Getting that fraction was a long journey, and the F-102 probably represents the greatest ever difference between the YF prototype and the production model. Aside from the fuselage shape and size changing, the tail grew taller, multiple flavours of J57 engine were tried, inlet shapes were changed, and so on and so forth. These changes continued well into production. The F-102 was part of an Air Force concept called the Cook-Craigie Plan that was intended to accelerate the development of new aircraft by starting to develop production tooling at the same time as development was ongoing. Convair was very keen to get the much-delayed F-102 into high-rate production and make some money on the whole enterprise, and this plan was the most expedient way. The first official service-ready F-102s were therefore far from ready for combat when they were delivered to the ADC in June 1955. Intensive flight tests on those early production aircraft between July 1955 and January 1956 determined the need for a series of further modifications, After these modifications, the F-102A was able to demonstrate capability to accelerate up to Mach 1.5. The 23rd production F-102, delivered in December 1955, made another change to the design, introducing a larger fin. That fin is one of the Delta Dagger's most distinctive features, a tall, sharp triangle that pierces the sky over the airframe's aft section. The rudder is hydraulically actuated, and another distinctive feature, the speed brakes, sit at the fin's base. The intended production engine, the J57-P23A, entered service on yet another aircraft in June 1956, starting a battery of engine tests that would last until April 1957. The final major change, and the effective end of major alterations to the aircraft's aerodynamics and flight systems, came in late June 1957 with the adoption of the Case XX wing, which increased service ceiling to 55,000 feet and improved low-speed stability. This wing was ultimately retrofitted to all operational aircraft. It contained all of the Deuce's fuel, 1,085 good old US gallons. That's 4,107 litres if you like your liquid volumes metric. By the time that true production F-102As were entering squadron service in June 1956, the ADC was littered with various different half-working versions. Upgrading some of these with the appropriate wings, tails, engines and details would take some years. By December 31st, 1959, ADC could deploy 482 Deuces, amounting to about 40% of its fighter force. What these initial squadrons got was a needle-nosed, 68-foot-long interceptor with a roomy, pilot-friendly cockpit and a futuristic armament of guided missiles and rockets. These were housed in 3 bays below and aft of the cockpit. When the pilot pulled the trigger, the bays popped open, the missiles were extended into the slipstream on short rails and then immediately fired. 2 missile salvos were the default in the initial production run. When half of the fleet was later modified to fire the much larger AIM-26 Super Falcon, this changed to salvos of 3 missiles of conventional Falcons and just the single Super. 24 folding fin aircraft rockets were also contained in the bay doors. When the modifications to the Super Falcon took place, this number was reduced to 12. All of these weapons were controlled by the Hughes MG-10 fire control system, an upgrade on the interim MG3 which arrived in 1955 when it became clear that the promised digital MA1 would not arrive in time. The MG1 was a bit of a maintenance nightmare. Its sensitive valves were a constant issue for ground crews trying to keep such a complicated aircraft ready for action. But despite its limitations, the F-102 represented a terrific increase in capability for the Air Defense Command. It was faster and wider ranging than the F-89 and F-94s it replaced. F-102s deployed to operational squadrons then sat on 3 different alert levels. Typically, 2 aircraft and 2 crews would be at 5-minute alert. If an unidentified contact was detected in their sector, then the crews would scramble, running out to the flimsy corrugated steel structures that house the alert interceptors. The aim was to have those fueled and ready aircraft in the air within 5 minutes of the klaxon sounding. Another proportion of the squadron's F-102s were on 15-minute alert. If the initial pair either encountered an issue or, more concerningly, more targets appeared, then crews would take these fully armed interceptors out to meet them. Finally, a small number of aircraft were on a nominal 1-hour alert. These aircraft were armed with AIM-26 Super Falcon radar-guided missiles carrying a nuclear warhead designed to clear out formations of bombers in one shot. Unsurprisingly, these aircraft were intended to be kept back in the horrifying case of a massive Soviet attack coming in over the pole or across the Atlantic. The F-102 did not just intercept any unknown. As the ADC's premier interceptor, it was reserved for unknown contacts in one of the air defense identification zones on the US and Canada's sea and land border. The arrival of the F-102 into service meant this long-range interceptor mission could be handled by the Deuce, with Scorpions, Air National Guard Starfires, Sabre Dogs, Sabres and Super Sabres in good weather, and Canada's Canucks held back to defend point targets and to handle anyone who got through the F-102s. Alert fighters took off under instruction from the tower and departure control. The pilots were then handed to ground controllers in the sector's operations center. Controllers directed the interceptor on a heading and altitude to merge with the target. The aircraft's autopilot helped the pilot navigate on that heading in all weathers. With its relatively powerful afterburning engine and large delta wing full of fuel, the big Delta Dagger could get airborne carrying a Super Falcon and 3 Falcons in about a kilometre of runway and climb to 17,000 feet in the first minute of flight. 2 minutes later, the Deuce would be at 35,000, reaching 50,000 7 minutes later. Most mission profiles, however, kept the fighter at its optimum cruising altitude of 40,000 feet for as long as possible. At this point, the interceptor and the intruder would be approaching each other like bullets from a gun. In a full-on, no-holds-bar intercept, in wartime conditions, a pair of Deuces would proceed to the target at Mach 1.2. Intercepting a Bison would mean a closure speed of nearly half a mile a second. GCI's job was to place the interceptors into a basket from which they could effect the intercept. Their objective was to meet the intruder between 600 and 800 miles away from populated areas in order to allow time for a second attack to take place if the first failed. Once close enough to detect the contact on his own radar, say at 40 miles distance, the flight computer directed the pilot to the point of intercept using directions presented on the radar screen. The left control stick on the yoke held the adjustment functions for the radar, and pilots were trained to operate them instinctively even on pitch-black nights, concentrating on the radar screen in the center of their control panel all the while. Depending on the contact's heading and position relative to the interceptor's base, GCI would have set the pilot up for a front quarter or rear quarter engagement. In the event of a front quarter attack, the F-102's radar would paint the target for engagement with semi-active homing AIM-4 Falcons. Automatic target lock-on via the computer was the favoured attack mode, but the radar beam could also be steered manually by moving the left's control stick laterally. As he got on the pursuit curve, the pilot would select Missile on the armament control panel, and then set the safety switch to Armed and the igniter control panel to Tactical. When the optimum position was reached, an X would appear on the radar screen, at which point the pilot fired. He needed to keep the Deuce's nose pointed at the target for the first 3 seconds, then the X would disappear and the pilot could maneuver a little, although still with the nose broadly pointed at the target, until the missiles impacted. This provided the steering beam that they homed on. If the interceptor approached the target from the rear, then the infrared homing Falcon would be employed. Since these missiles were fire and forget, the interceptor was free to maneuver after they had been fired. In both cases, the flight computer provided cues on how to maneuver the fighter and when to fire the missiles. If the missiles failed to down the target, then the last resort was to employ the Deuce's 2 3/4-inch folding fin aircraft rockets. The fire control system also offered engagement modes for their use from the front, rear, or on the beam. Automatic tracking and firing was accomplished in essentially the same way as with missiles, except that the weapons selector would be set to rocket. Obvious, but important. If all else failed, then a manual gun sight was also provided, a lesson perhaps learned from the F-89 Scorpion. The sight allowed the pilot to select the size of the target in order to increase the chances of a successful hit, as you can see on this helpful schematic. If the interceptor was one of the backup aircraft armed with the AIM-26 nuclear Falcon, then the attack profile was similar but the firing sequence was modified. Starting with radar contact with the target and instruction to engage, first the pilot armed the missile, the only nuclear weapon in the US arsenal that could be armed and fired by one person without command authority. Next, he pulled down the curtains that would protect his vision from the flash of a nuclear blast. Then, under radar direction, he would pull up into a steep climb in afterburner. Releasing the missile at the appropriate moment and then turning and diving to separate. In the event of a live firing, the pilot would have a matter of seconds before the supersonic rocket reached the given point and detonated, annihilating everything within a 1-mile diameter sphere. A live nuclear Falcon round was never fired, so we have no idea of its efficacy. Once his mission was complete, in as little as 45 to 60 minutes given the afterburner's prodigious thirst, the pilot could rely on an automatic landing system to get him home. All he needed to do was to control when to actuate the landing gear and then fly the final flare before setting down. Quite how this beacon-based system would have fared amidst the comms jamming and radiation interference of a nuclear war is open for debate, but in peacetime it appears to have been an effective system and enhanced the Deuce's all-weather capability. In later years, the F-102 would be fitted with a data link for the SAGE automated interception system, enabling it to receive GCI cues directly into the flight control system. This wasn't as automated as the system in the later F-106, but it did further reduce GCI workload and response time. An infrared search and track system, which looked like a chrome ball fitted under the cockpit, was installed during the upgrade to MG-10. This system couldn't cue weapons, but it did have impressive range, up to 60 miles, and could be used to point the radar antenna onto the right bearing in the face of heavy jamming. There was a switch in the cockpit marked IR/radar slaved that enabled this steering to happen automatically. It's interesting to me why such systems fell out of favour in the USAF. Both the F-102 and F-101 Voodoo had IR search and track systems, and they were well liked by pilots. The ground control intercept procedures took many years to hone. In 1957, exercises with SAC revealed a lamentably poor interception rate, particularly at high altitudes. ADC squadrons then put in serious flight hours to practice, many pilots clocking upwards of 30 hours of flight time a month in their F-102s. The pilot interviews I've seen suggest that flying the Deuce was a pleasant experience. The cockpit was roomy and the controls were light. The aircraft was stable in flight and easy to take off and land once the Delta Wing's quirks were mastered. The main complaints in the interceptor role were the terrible visibility through the cockpit, which featured thick rails, zero rear visibility because of the prominent air intakes and the hard seat pad. Not terrible issues for an interceptor. Confirming the Deuce's total inadequacy as an air superiority fighter, the radar did not appreciate G-force. If the pilot engaged in an impromptu scuffle with another fighter, then it'd invariably attract the ire of the ground control, who had to figure out the blank screen this caused. In all, 889 F-102As were built for the USAF, of which 875 were accepted into squadron service. The aircraft's development cost $101.9 million in 1958, or about $1.1 billion in 2023. Unit cost was $1.2 million, about $13.6 million today. F-35 unit cost is about $75 million for reference. A flight hour costs $611, touch under $7,000 in 2023. The F-35 is a bit over $40,000 again for reference. The Deuce's phase out into the Air National Guard started in the early 1960s, however the last regular Air Force squadron to be equipped with them was the Black Knights, the 57th Fighter Interceptor Squadron out of Keflavik, Iceland. They received 14 F-102s in 1962. These, quite remarkably, replaced F-89D Scorpions, which were still flying frontline intercept nearly a decade after their introduction. The Scorpions' airframes were so exhausted that they couldn't be flown back to the US and remained at Keflavik as training hulks for the fire and rescue teams. The 57th were also probably the last ADC squadron to operate the F-102, finally converting to F-4C Phantoms in 1973. As the F-106 entered widespread service, the Deuce's phase-out into Air National Guard gathered pace. By 1964, they equipped 10 Air National Guard squadrons, and in the late 1960s, 22 ANG squadrons were flying the type, at which point Deuces began to be retired for good. It's worth saying at this point that in this period, the ANG was very much considered part of the overall force and often flew frontline or recent frontline interceptors. The Deuce was therefore definitely considered combat ready by the ADC into the late 1960s. Amongst the many postings of F-102s was the 509th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, attached to the 405th Fighter Wing at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. The 509th had converted to the F-102 from the F-86D Sabre Dog in 1960, and were amongst the most advanced fighters assigned to Pacific Air Command at the time. Their quiet posting would not last long. On the 19th and 20th of March 1962, a series of illegal intrusions were detected in South Vietnam's Central Highlands. Gravely concerned by these overflights, the South Vietnamese government asked for US assistance. 4 F-102s were sent from Clark to provide all-weather coverage of the area. During this operation, codenamed Waterglass, they flew 21 sorties without detecting an enemy and then returned to Clark. Nevertheless, so began the Deuce's nearly 8-year-long deployment to Southeast Asia. Things could have panned out very differently. Under a project called Clearwater, the intention of the US was to make Asian nations more responsible for their own defense. To that end, the F-102 was supposed to disappear from the Pacific Air Command's inventory during 1964, with some squadrons converting to the new multi-role F-4C Phantom II. This plan changed on August 2, 1964, when US warships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Shortly thereafter, President Lyndon Johnson ordered US aircraft from Pacific Air Command to be deployed to permanent bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. Having sent aircraft to the region on and off during 1963 and 1964, the 509th were the first full squadron to be deployed. To an extent, they had never actually left, as a detachment of 4 Deuces had been consistently deployed to Thailand from 1961 onward to train the Royal Thai Air Force in interception and air defence, as part of an operation called Beltone. 1960s operations had such amazing names. A lost art. Because their local bases lacked the capability to perform maintenance on the complex and finicky F-102 systems, aircraft were rotated between the 3 bases they occupied in South Vietnam and Thailand and Clark. Later in the year, the 509th figured out a way of training more ground crew and the stressful rotations ended. In the early days, the Deuces were on 24/7 alert in case of further intrusions across the border. In the main, their scrambles were to try and intercept slow-moving piston-engine Colt biplanes moving south of the border. These were very hazardous missions for the fast-moving Deuce, as the Vietnamese aircraft's maximum speed was below the stall speed of the F-102, and they flew at extremely low level in poor weather. Deuces also scrambled to escort damaged US aircraft returning to base. Occasionally, they would intercept and escort airliners that had strayed off course. Basically, the F-102s were busy but unheralded in this period. Poor conditions and nighttime operations meant that instrument landings using ILS were the norm for US pilots. The F-102's sophistication was a significant plus point. It was partly for this reason that the F-102 was also employed as a weather reporting aircraft throughout the war. On these early missions, the F-102s typically carried a single AIM-26B, a conventionally armed version of the Super Falcon, and 3 infrared AIM-4C Falcons. For some reason that is lost to history, the detachment of Deuces at Bangkok flew with a combination of AIM-4C and AIM-4A semi-active radar homing Falcons. F-102s deployed to Southeast Asia retained their nuclear weapons capability, but they had the SAGE antennas and data link removed as this system was not present in Asia. The Deuces were so busy that in 1966 a second detachment was established at Udon in Thailand. Getting the F-102s there from the mainland USA meant developing a crude in-flight refueling setup that enabled the Deuces to be dragged across the Pacific by tankers. The pipework for this installation was draggy and reduced performance by about 10%, but it worked well enough. An additional 10.5-pint oxygen bottle was carried in the missile bay to facilitate the important process of pilot breathing during the ferry flight. On landing, the entire setup was removed so that the F-102s could assume their duties. By 1967, 24 Deuces were deployed in Thailand and South Vietnam at any one time, of which as many as 14 were on 5-minute alert. Although they performed many escort duties from 1964 to 1969, run-ins with MiGs were few and far between. This, incidentally, was the common situation for US fighters. It wasn't as if the skies were swarming with MiGs in the first place, and those that did would often bug out if it looked like US fighters were alerted to their presence. Once in a while, the Deuces would be directed to intercept MiGs coming for their charges. either by Motorpool, the Navy cruiser out in the Gulf of Tonkin, the GCI site at Monkey Mountain, or College Eye, the EC-121 proto-AWACS that orbited over Laos or Thailand. Rocketing towards the MiGs in afterburner, the F-102s would attempt to lock on with their radars. Occasionally their pilots even broke the safeties and armed their Falcons, but they never did get to take a shot at the MiGs as they would turn and flee the area. Lacking sufficient performance differential and wary of a trap, the Deuces didn't pursue. The one incident in which a Deuce did get to fire on a MiG was in an ambush on February 3, 1968, in which a MiG-21 shot down an F-102 from the 509th, killing Captain Wallace Wiggins. I've covered that in detail in another video, which I'll link to in the show notes. That is not to say that the F-102s didn't take shots in anger. Far from it. In fact, the Deuces were employed in a totally unexpected role. Interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail was an ongoing and largely thankless task performed by US air power throughout the Vietnam War. The trail wound through mountains and jungles largely under tree cover. Supply convoys often moved at night, making interdiction even harder. Almost every type of US aircraft in the theatre was used at some point to attack the trail, from bird dogs to B-52s. With that in mind, it is perhaps a little less surprising that the Deuce, probably the least likely candidate for ground attack in the entire US inventory, was pressed into service as an interdictor from 1965 onwards. The source of its advantage in this particular, very niche application was the IR search and track sensor. No other aircraft in theatre had this capability. The F-102 was also an all-weather aircraft and thus capable of undertaking night missions. Many hundreds of sorties were flown by Deuces over the trail, flying south to north and using their IR sensors to detect the heat from truck engines or from fires lit by hand and animal cart crews. Once detected, the Deuces would either attack with rockets or sometimes by launching a volley of AIM-4Ds. Results are impossible to assess, but one can only imagine the surprise caused by an air-to-air missile landing in your campfire in the dead of night. Martin B-57s would sometimes loiter nearby to bomb anything illuminated in the initial strike. Not satisfied with their nocturnal activities, F-102s also carried out over 600 sorties in daytime, attacking targets from trucks to sampans and even a bridge. Using the longer ground attack versions of the 2 3/4-inch rocket meant that the Deuce could only carry 6 rounds in total, so the aircraft was extremely limited in this role, but it did at least allow its crews to get in on the war. In 1967, a brief effort was made to mount podded 7.62mm miniguns on the drop tank pylons, but no missions were flown in this configuration when it was realised how little extra firepower was actually going to be added. One Deuce was lost to ground fire on a strafing run on the 15th of December 1965. In total, 14 were lost during the war, 1 to a MiG, as I mentioned earlier, 4 to enemy sappers in 2 separate attacks on their bases, 1 to small arms fire from an infiltrator team that attacked it just as it was taking off, and 7 to various operational incidents, including one that collided with an RF-4A on the ground. The first loss was in November 1964, the last on the 7th of January 1969. Its largely unheralded but valuable contribution to the war in Vietnam ended shortly thereafter, and the type was withdrawn to the US. The Deuce served with the Air National Guard until 1976. By this time, the airframes and engines were thoroughly worn out, and the availability of early Phantoms made their retention unproductive. After their retirement, 89 aircraft were converted into target drones in a program called Paved Use. These drones made a major contribution to the development of the F-15 Eagle and Patriot SAM systems. Once again, the Deuce's role was quiet and behind the scenes, an easy aircraft to overlook in the arc of the Cold War. So how should we think about the F-102? Like many of the interim aircraft projects of the 1950s and early 1960s, its successes and role are largely forgotten. It was, after all, succeeded by an aircraft revered as the ultimate interceptor. Its combat role seems unremarkable, particularly when compared to the F-4 and F-100. But serve it did, flying tens of thousands of missions in Vietnam and 15 years on alert in bases across the US and Europe in case the worst was to happen. Flying that mission is no cakewalk. Launching on alert into bad weather on a moonless night to face a potential nuclear-armed attacker requires guts and skill. 259 Delta Daggers were lost and 70 pilots were killed in operational accidents. On one branch there is the multi-seat and two-seat line that started with the P-61 Black Widow, moved past the F-94 Starfire and culminated in the F-89 Scorpion. On the other is the other interim interceptor of the early 1950s, the F-86D Saberdog, which attempted to introduce automation to replace the second crewman. The Deuce sits somewhere between these two camps dynamically. It has greater speed and acceleration than the Sabre, while carrying the weapon load of a J-model Scorpion and a step change in automation that eliminates the need for the backseater. Improved GCI also contributes in that domain. Although it can't turn with the Sabre, the Deuce does turn better than the Scorpion and can fly further and higher to boot. Raw turning performance is really not an essential for a bomber interceptor in any case. As soon as it entered service, the Deuce reset the strategic balance that had been tilted out of equilibrium by the unveiling of the Bison and Bear. If the unthinkable was being considered, then Soviet and Chinese planners would have to accept the reality that their bombers would encounter a determined and technologically superior force of defenders, whatever the weather and whatever the time of day. Beyond the F-102 developmentally is the F-106, which further evolved the fire control system, aerodynamics and engine to produce an outstanding all-round aircraft. Although the ADC would have loved to get there in one step, leaping to it in just one step from the Scorpion, Starfire and Saberdog was simply impossible despite the incredible speed of progress that was happening in the 1950s. There is always something just around the corner, but that still leaves the problem of today and tomorrow. So that's the F-102 Delta Dagger, a deterrent, a fighter in being, the ultimate interim, the Deuce. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been a labour of love. As ever, any and all comments greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching.